I'm 5 months pregnant and about to marry Africa's most powerful billionaire. But 10 minutes ago, I learned the man I'm carrying for is the same one who ordered my father's death. The world sees a reformed hero with a tragic scar. I see a state-backed killer who traffics girls, silences witnesses, and buries anyone who gets too close. They think he rushed me here for a medical emergency. They don't know I'm inside this clinic to end his bloodline, starting with what he just sent to my phone. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by chance. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The air inside the St. Jude's private wing tasted of antiseptic and suppressed screams, a sharp contrast to the humid, salt-heavy breeze of the Lagos Lagoon just blocks away. Amara sat on the edge of the narrow cot, her silk bridal robe, a useless, beautiful relic of a life that had ended 3 hours ago, clutched tightly around her shivering frame. Outside those double-pane glass windows, the world was a cacophony of flashing blue lights and the rhythmic, aggressive thrum of a news helicopter hovering like a mechanical vulture. They were all there for him. Elias Thorne, the billionaire savior, the man with the jagged scar that ran like a lightning bolt from his temple to his jaw, the man who was currently turning the hospital parking lot into a theatrical stage of feigned husbandly devotion. The irony was a physical weight in her chest. The media saw a distraught groom trying to save his unborn child, while Amara saw a monster trying to reclaim a piece of property. Every time the camera flashes pulsed against the hospital walls, she saw the ghost of her father, his face pale and sweating as the toxins Elias had injected into him 20 years ago slowly turned his blood to lead. Below, the heavy tires of a black armored SUV screeched to a halt, and the sea of paparazzi parted like the Red Sea for a dark god. Elias stepped out, his posture impeccable, the scar on his face catching the harsh glare of the television lights, making him look like a tragic hero from Shakespearean play. He didn't look like a man who trafficked girls across the Togolese border. He looked like the pillar of Nigerian industry, the man who had promised to protect Amara from a world he had secretly spent decades destroying. He began to speak to the microphones, his voice a baritone hum that vibrated through the very floorboards beneath Amara's feet, spinning a web of lies about stress and maternal health. He was coming for her. He was coming to ensure that the lineage of the assassin remained intact, unaware that the woman inside had already traded her wedding ring for a surgical gown. The nurse at the door looked at Amara with pity, misinterpreting her terror for grief, while Amara looked at the clock, praying for the doctor to return before the man who killed her past arrived to claim her future. They had met during the height of the Harmattan season, when the dust from the Sahara draped Lagos in a ghostly, golden haze that made everything feel like a dream. Amara had been leaving a charity gala when a group of armed men, acting with a precision that should have been a red flag, attempted to hijack her vehicle. Out of the swirling dust, Elias Thorne had appeared like a guardian angel, his movements a blur of lethal efficiency as he neutralized the threat without breaking a sweat. It was a masterclass in psychological bonding. He had created the danger just so he could be the one to extinguish it, cementing himself in her mind as the only safe harbor in a chaotic city. Over the months that followed, he courted her with a slow, methodical intensity, peeling back the layers of her trauma while keeping his own buried under layers of bespoke Italian wool and philanthropic donations. He listened to her stories about her father's mysterious death with a focused, empathetic silence that she mistook for love, never once flinching when she described the kidnapper's voice, a voice that, had she been listening closely enough, was a perfect match for the one whispering sweet nothings into her ear at night. As their relationship deepened, Elias built a fortress around her, both literal and metaphorical. He upgraded her security, monitored her movements for her safety, and replaced her father's old associates with his own hand-picked men from Thorne Global. He was the architect of a new reality where she was the queen, and he was the ironclad wall protecting her from the ghosts of her childhood. He used his scar as a prop, telling her it was a souvenir from a botched peacekeeping mission in the north, a badge of honor for a man who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to be better. In his arms, the nightmares of her 3-year-old self faded, replaced by the intoxicating heat of a man who seemed capable of stopping time itself. She had fallen for the mask, enamored by the way a man so powerful could be so gentle with her, never realizing that his gentleness was merely the velvet glove hiding the same calloused hand that had once tightened a blindfold around her father's eyes in a damp cellar 2 decades ago. The changed man was his greatest performance, a billion-dollar lie designed to colonize the heart of the only person who could ever truly expose him. The memory of her 3rd year on Earth was not a sequence of events, but a collection of sensory terrors that smelled of damp concrete and the metallic tang of old blood. Amara could still recall the way the shadows danced on the peeling walls of the basement where they held her father, a place that felt like the very bowels of the world. Her father, Chief Adeyemi Bello, had been a man of immense gravity and even greater kindness, but in that dark hole, he had been reduced to a shivering mass of bone and desperation. The man who came to collect the ransom, the man with the voice like grinding stones, had stood over them with a terrifying stillness, his face obscured by a tactical mask that offered no hint of the monster beneath. When the money was finally delivered, a king's ransom packed into weathered leather duffels, there was no celebration, only a cold, clinical efficiency. They didn't just release him, they delivered him back to the world like a piece of faulty machinery that had been sabotaged from the inside. Amara remembered the way the man with the gravelly voice had touched her father's neck with a small, silver device, a movement so swift and seemingly innocuous that it looked like a gesture of twisted comfort. It was the parting gift, a slow-acting venom that would ensure that even in freedom, her father would never truly escape his captors. The decline was a grueling 2-year funeral. As the doctors in Lagos and London scratched their heads, Chief Bello withered, his skin turning a translucent, sickly gray as if he were being erased from the inside out. By the time they discovered the toxic synthetic compounds, substances that didn't just attack the organs but rewritten the body's chemistry to fail, it was far too late. Amara's childhood died in those hospital corridors, replaced by a cold, burning need to understand why a man would choose to kill so slowly when a bullet would have been more merciful. The autopsy reports were her first bedtime stories. She memorized the chemical structures of the poisons that had robbed her of a father's embrace. Her mother had whispered that it was a government hit, a shadow operation gone wrong. But to Amara, it was personal. It was the work of an artist of death, someone who took pleasure in the lingering echo of a kill. She grew up in a house that felt like a mausoleum, surrounded by the wealth her father had left behind, which felt like dirty water in her mouth. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the girl who had watched her hero turn into ash, never realizing that the man responsible for the furnace was currently building a throne for himself in the very city she called home. Elias Thorne did not just enter a room. He reconfigured the oxygen within it to suit his own lungs. By the time he was 35, he had successfully scrubbed the Viper from the digital records of the Nigerian intelligence agency, emerging from the shadows as a titan of private security. He traded the tactical vest for double-breasted charcoal suits that cost more than the annual budget of a small village, and he traded the silenced pistol for a boardroom table that functioned with equal lethality. Thorne Global Security was his masterpiece of misdirection, a company that promised to secure the future, while its founder was busy burying the past. He moved through the high-stakes circles of Ikoyi and Victoria Island with the practiced grace of a reformed saint, his jagged scar serving as a convenient prop, a testament to a heroic service to the state that never actually happened. To the public, he was the ultimate success story, a man who had survived the trenches of national security to build a multi-billion naira empire. He was a man who provided the armored convoys for visiting dignitaries and the biometric systems for the nation's largest banks, all while maintaining a private server room that held the blackmail material on every politician who dared to question his rise. The corporate culture at Thorne Global was one of absolute, terrifying loyalty, built on the premise that Elias was a man of impeccable character who had simply seen too much. Behind the glass walls of his penthouse office, However, the security operations were merely the legitimate scaffolding for a much darker architecture. He understood that the most effective way to hide a crime was to surround it with 100 virtues. He donated to orphanages, funded police reform initiatives, and spoke at youth empowerment summits, all while his shadow fleet of vehicles moved undetected across West African borders. His employees didn't just fear him. They worshipped the myth of the changed man, the soldier who had turned his back on violence to become a pillar of industry. Elias enjoyed the irony of it all, that the very people he had once been paid to eliminate were now paying him for protection. He had mastered the art of the clean kill in business, bankrupting rivals with the same clinical detachment he had once used to administer toxins. He was a man who believed he had outrun his own shadow, convinced that if he built his tower high enough, the blood on the foundation would never reach the penthouse. Their courtship was a symphony of psychological manipulation that Amara mistook for a once-in-a-lifetime romance. Elias didn't just date her. He curated an experience designed to heal the very wounds he had inflicted 20 years prior. He was the man who remembered her favorite obscure Nigerian poets and the exact temperature she liked her tea, a level of attention that felt like a warm blanket to a woman who had grown up in the cold shadow of grief. When they were together, he would often lead her into conversations about the fragility of life and the importance of legacy, his voice dropping into that low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in her very marrow. He made her feel like the most secure woman in West Africa, surrounding her with a protective detail that he claimed was a necessity of his status, but which she eventually realized was a perimeter designed to keep the truth out as much as it was to keep her in. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and the faint, underlying scent of gun oil, a scent he explained away as the smell of the job, but which to Amara's subconscious was the smell of the room where her father died. The news of the pregnancy had felt like the final piece of a beautiful puzzle falling into place. For Amara, it was a chance to finally build the family that had been stolen from her. For Elias, it was the ultimate insurance policy. He had held her in their sprawling garden overlooking the Atlantic, his hand resting on her stomach with a possessiveness that she interpreted as paternal love. In that moment, he looked almost human, the sunlight softening the harsh lines of his scar, making him look like a man who had finally found peace. He promised her a wedding that would be the event of the decade, a celebration of life and new beginnings that would signal his final transition into a family man. He bought her a diamond that was the size of a small bird's egg, a stone so bright it felt like it could blind anyone who looked too closely at the darkness behind it. Amara spent those months in a haze of prenatal vitamins and silk swatches, convinced that she had finally found a man who was strong enough to carry the weight of her past. She didn't realize that she was carrying the child of the man who had turned her father into a ghost, or that the new beginning he promised was actually the final act of a long-running assassination. The night before the wedding, the presidential suite of the Eco-Signature Hotel felt more like a gilded cage than a sanctuary. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 imported lilies, their fragrance so cloyingly sweet it made Amara's stomach churn with an onset of morning sickness that felt like a physical warning. Outside, the Lagos skyline twinkled with a deceptive beauty, the lights of the third mainland bridge stretching out like a string of pearls across the dark water. Amara stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection ghostly against the glass, framed by her Vera Wang gown hanging like a silent witness in the corner. There was a heaviness in the air, a drop in atmospheric pressure that usually preceded a violent tropical storm. She felt a strange, inexplicable urge to run, a primal instinct screaming that the man sleeping in the adjacent room was not the man she thought he was. Every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see Elias's smile. She saw the jagged geography of his scar, which in the dim light looked less like a battle wound and more like a crack in a porcelain mask that was starting to shatter. Her bridesmaids had long since departed, leaving her with her thoughts and the rhythmic ticking of a clock that sounded like a countdown. She tried to tell herself it was just pre-wedding jitters, the natural anxiety of a woman about to bind her life to a titan of industry. But the unease was deeper than that. It was a bone-deep recognition of a lie. She looked at the ultrasound photo on the nightstand, a grainy, black-and-white image of life that was half her and half him, and felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She realized she knew everything about Elias's present, but his past was a series of carefully constructed vignettes, stories that were too polished, too perfect. He was a man who had emerged fully formed from the ashes of a war zone, with no childhood friends, no aging relatives, and no history that hadn't been vetted by his own PR team. The opulence of the suite began to feel suffocating, the silk sheets like a shroud. She needed air, she needed a distraction, and she needed to confirm that the man she was about to marry wasn't just a shadow she had mistaken for a son. The revelation didn't come in a dramatic confrontation or a discovered letter. It came from the mouth of a bored receptionist in the hotel's VIP lounge who didn't know when to stop talking. Amara had gone down to the lobby in the middle of the night, driven by a restless energy and a craving for ginger ale to settle her stomach. The girl behind the desk, a young woman named Titi, who was clearly starstruck by the impending wedding of the century, began to gush about how lucky Amara was to be marrying a man as feared as Elias Thorne. She spoke with a casual, terrifying familiarity about Elias's reputation in the security circles of West Africa, mentioning how her own brother had worked at the Semeb border and had seen the Thorne Global trucks moving through the night without ever being inspected. "They call him the Viper at the border, ma," Titi said with a giggle, unaware that she was dropping a nuclear bomb into Amara's life. "My brother says even the customs officers hide when they see that scar. They know he's the one who handled the high-profile removals for the old regime. He's a legend in the underground, moving everything from gold to, well, cargo." The word Viper hit Amara with the force of a physical blow, sending a cold shiver down her spine that made her teeth chatter. It was the code name she had seen in her father's old, confidential files, the name of the operative who had led the kidnapping team 20 years ago. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the polished marble floors of the lobby becoming a slick, dangerous precipice. She forced herself to maintain a neutral expression, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, as she asked Titi for more details with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. The girl, eager to please, went on to describe the rumors of the Green Route, a trafficking pipeline that moved girls from the slums of Lagos through the porous borders of Benin, Togo, and into Ghana, all under the guise of security logistics. The realization was a jagged blade in Amara's gut. Elias wasn't just a killer. He was a slaver. The man she was pregnant with, the man she was supposed to vow her life to in 10 hours, was the architect of the very suffering she had spent her life trying to alleviate. She left the lobby not with a ginger ale, but with the cold, hard certainty that she was sleeping in the arms of the devil. Back in the suite, the silence was now a deafening roar. Amara waited until she heard the steady, rhythmic breathing of Elias from the bedroom, the breathing of a man with a clear conscience, which was the most terrifying thing of all. She moved to his study, her bare feet silent on the plush Persian rugs. She knew the passcode to his private laptop. He had given it to her months ago as a gesture of absolute trust, a calculated move to ensure she never felt the need to look. Her fingers trembled as she typed in the numbers, their anniversary, another layer of his sick irony. The desktop was a sterile landscape of corporate icons, but she didn't look at the files marked budget or mergers. She went deep into the system archives, looking for hidden partitions, her knowledge of her father's business helping her navigate the digital maze. She found a folder buried 3 layers deep, encrypted with a secondary key. She tried Viper. It didn't work. She tried Adeyemi. The folder clicked open, a digital tombstone for her father. Inside were the assassination logs, meticulous clinical records of shadow operations from 2 decades ago. She found the entry for Operation Silent Bell. There was her father's name, his home address, and a list of his daily routines. But it was the method of neutralization that made her vomit into the wastebasket. It detailed the administration of a slow-acting neurotoxin 4B, designed to mimic natural organ failure over a 24-month period to avoid international scrutiny. The logs were signed with a digital thumbprint that belonged to Elias Thorne. There were photos, too, surveillance shots of her father holding her hand at the park, her 3-year-old face blurred in the background while the crosshairs of a camera focused on her father's heart. She saw the ransom logistics, confirming that the money was never meant to save him, only to fund the next series of kills. The man she loved had built his empire on her father's blood, using the very money he stole from her family to buy the ring currently sparkling on her finger. She sat in the dark, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her tear-filled eyes, realizing that her entire life since that day had been a carefully managed epilogue to her father's murder. The horror didn't stop with her father. As Amara scrolled further, she found the active logistics folder, a real-time map of Elias's current operations. This wasn't ancient history. This was the present. She saw a spreadsheet titled Humanitarian Transit, a euphemism so vile it made her skin crawl. It was a list of names, ages, and destination values for hundreds of young women. The green route was real. She saw the GPS coordinates for holding cells in Cotonou and Lomé, hidden in plain sight within Thorne global warehouses. The security team she had seen at his office weren't protecting the city. They were guarding the cargo of souls. Elias had used his government connections to create a frictionless corridor for human trafficking, moving vulnerable girls across West Africa with the same efficiency he moved armored trucks. He was selling daughters just like her, girls who had no billionaire fathers to pay a ransom, girls who would disappear into the dark underbelly of the continent, while Elias Thorne stood on stages and talked about the new Africa. She saw the financial ties. The money from the trafficking ring was being laundered through his charitable foundations, the same foundations she had helped him promote. She was an accomplice, a beautiful face used to mask a mechanism of industrial-scale cruelty. The baby kicked inside her, a sharp, sudden movement that felt like a jolt of electricity. She looked down at her stomach with a sense of profound revulsion. This child would be the heir to a throne of bones. It would grow up with the features of a man who looked at human beings as units of transit. She realized then that she couldn't just leave. She had to burn it all down. But first, she had to ensure that the Viper's bloodline ended with her. She closed the laptop, her mind now a cold, calculating machine, mirroring the man she was about to destroy. She had 5 hours until the wedding began. 5 hours to transform from a victim into an executioner. She didn't need a gun. She had the truth, and in Elias Thorne's world, the truth was the only toxin he hadn't built an immunity to. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the Atlantic, turning the sky a bruised purple, Amara began her silent exodus. She didn't take the Vera Wang gown, the jewelry, or the designer shoes. She dressed in a simple pair of black leggings and a hoodie, looking like any other woman out for an early morning run. She left her phone on the nightstand, knowing it was tracked, and took only a burner phone she had hidden weeks ago for a just-in-case scenario she never truly believed would happen. She slipped out through the service elevator, her heart thumping in time with the distant sound of the waves. She didn't go to the police. Elias owned the police. She didn't go to her mother. Elias would look there first. She headed for a small, private clinic on the outskirts of Suralire, a place run by a woman her father had once helped, a place far from the glittering skyscrapers of the elite, where she could disappear into the grit of the real Lagos. When she reached the clinic, the air was thick with the smell of exhaust and frying akara from a nearby street stall. The contrast to the eco-signature hotel was jarring, a visceral reminder of the world Elias exploited. She walked into the sterile, dimly lit waiting room, her face pale and her eyes burning with a lack of sleep. She told the doctor she needed an immediate termination. She didn't offer a reason, and she didn't cry. The revulsion she felt toward the life inside her was so total that it had bypassed grief and gone straight to a cold, surgical necessity. She felt as though she were carrying a ticking bomb, a physical manifestation of Elias's crimes that she needed to excise before it could consume her. As she was led back to the procedure room, she saw a television in the corner. The morning news was already flashing images of the wedding of the century, with a reporter standing outside the hotel talking about the beautiful bride who would soon be walking down the aisle. Amara looked at her own hands, steady and cold, and realized that by the time the sun was high in the sky, the bride would be a ghost and the changed man would be a hunted animal. The disappearance of Amara Bello ignited a firestorm that Lagos hadn't seen in decades. By 9 a.m., the Eco Signature Hotel was a fortress under siege, not by enemies, but by the very media Elias had invited to document his triumph. When the groom realized the bride was gone, he didn't panic. He pivoted. Elias Thorne, the master of optics, realized that a runaway bride was a PR disaster, but a kidnapped pregnant wife was a tragedy that could be used to mobilize the entire state. He stood before the cameras, his face a mask of controlled, masculine grief, his voice breaking at just the right moments as he pleaded for Amara's safe return. He directed his private security force to coordinate with the national police, effectively turning the search for Amara into a state-sponsored manhunt. He used the media as a bloodhound, broadcasting her photo on every digital billboard in the city, framing her flight as a medical emergency caused by the stress of the high-profile nuptials. By the time the news reached the clinic in Surulere, the building was already surrounded by a sea of paparazzi and Thorne global SUVs. Elias had tracked her not through her phone, but through the biometric data of his own security perimeter. He had anticipated every exit. The hospital standoff became a televised event, a high-stakes drama played out in real time for millions of viewers. Outside, the crowd chanted Elias's name, believing they were supporting a desperate husband trying to save his wife and unborn child from a mental breakdown. Inside, Amara sat in a cold room, listening to the sirens and the shouting, realizing that Elias was using the world as a shield to keep her from escaping. He wasn't there to save her. He was there to reclaim his narrative. He knew that if she spoke, his empire would crumble, so he was making sure the world only heard his version of the story. The standoff wasn't about love or a baby. It was a battle for the truth, fought in the glare of 1,000 camera flashes as the changed man prepared to tear down the walls to keep his secrets buried. The corridor of the Surulere clinic felt like a wind tunnel, though the air was dead and heavy with the smell of cheap floor wax and old fear. Elias Thorne's footsteps did not hurry. They were the rhythmic, terrifying thuds of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. When he reached the heavy oak door of the procedure room, he didn't pound on it like a frantic husband. Instead, he placed a single, leather-gloved hand against the wood, a gesture that felt more like a claim of ownership than knock. Outside, the world was screaming, the sirens, the shouts of the crowd, the frantic questions of reporters being held back by his men. But here, in the dim light of the hallway, there was only the sound of his voice. It was a low, honeyed baritone, the same voice that had whispered promises of eternity in the gardens of Ikoyi, now vibrating through the door with a chilling, magnetic authority. He spoke of love, of misunderstandings, and of the miracle they were carrying, his words designed to sound like a lifeline to anyone listening. But to Amara, sitting on the cold linoleum floor with her back against the door, his voice was the rattle of a snake. He told her the media was there to protect her, that he had called the best doctors in the country to assist her, weaving a narrative of paternal concern that masked the iron fist waiting to drag her back into his manufactured paradise. Inside the room, Amara felt the vibration of his presence through her spine, a cold chill that seemed to turn her marrow to ice. She knew the choreography of his manipulation, the way he would frame her as unstable to the world while whispering her crimes to her in private. She looked at the surgical tray, the cold steel instruments reflecting the flickering fluorescent light, and realized that the door was the only thing standing between the truth and a lifetime of gilded slavery. Elias began to talk about the nursery he had built, describing the hand-painted murals and the imported crib, using the imagery of a domestic dream to smother the reality of his blood-soaked empire. Every word was a tactical strike, an attempt to gaslight her into believing that her discovery in the middle of the night was merely a fever dream brought on by hormonal imbalance. He was playing for the microphones he knew were hidden in the pockets of the staff, crafting a masterpiece of a loving husband for the evening news, while his other hand likely rested on the grip of the concealed weapon he always carried. He wasn't just asking her to come out. He was demanding she surrender her reality to his, promising that if she just opened the door, he would forgive her for the lapse in judgment, and they could go back to the lie they had been living. The silence between them stretched, thick with 20 years of unspoken history, until Elias shifted his weight, his shadow lengthening under the door. He began to speak of the scar, not the sanitized version he told at charity galas, but the jagged, ugly truth of its origin. He described a moonless night on the border of Nigeria and Benin, a mission where he wasn't a security consultant, but a shadow operative with a mandate to erase a man who knew too much. He spoke of the humid heat of the jungle, the way the mosquitoes sounded like a dull roar, and the moment he looked into the eyes of a man who refused to beg. That man was Chief Adeyemi Bello. Elias admitted, for the first time, that the scar wasn't earned in a peacekeeping mission, but by a frantic, desperate struggle as her father fought for his life with a broken piece of glass. The scar was a permanent reminder of the only man who had ever truly made him feel the weight of his own monstrous nature. He described the moment he injected the toxin, his voice devoid of remorse, almost as if he were discussing a technical achievement in a boardroom. He had watched her father's life leak out of him, not in a rush, but in a slow, agonizing drip, and in that moment of cold triumph, he had seen a 3-year-old girl watching from the shadows of the hallway. The revelation was a physical weight that pressed the air out of Amara's lungs. Elias's voice grew softer, more intimate, as he confessed that he had spent the last 2 decades tracking her, not out of guilt, but out of a perverse sense of completion. He had watched her grow, curated her opportunities, and eventually inserted himself into her life like a parasite seeking a host. He saw her as the final prize of his career, the ultimate proof that he could take everything from a man and then claim his most precious legacy as his own. The love he felt for her was a twisted form of narcissism. He loved her because she was the living evidence of his absolute power over the Bello bloodline. He spoke of the child in her womb not as a son or daughter, but as a synthesis, a way to finally merge the killer and the victim into a single, unbreakable dynasty. He wasn't just a man who had changed. He was a man who had evolved his cruelty into a form of high art, using the trauma of her childhood as the foundation for his own domestic bliss. The scar on his face wasn't a badge of honor. It was the mark of Cain, a jagged line that connected the blood on his hands to the ring on her finger. "I know about the Silent Bell Protocol, Elias," Amara whispered, her voice cracking the polished veneer of his monologue. The name of the operation hung in the air like a ghost, a sudden, sharp silence falling over the man on the other side of the door. She spoke about the chemical composition of the toxin, the synthetic compounds that had turned her father's final years into a slow-motion execution. She described the way her father's hands had shaken, the way his mind had frayed, and the way he had eventually forgotten her name before his heart finally gave out. She wasn't just reading from a file. She was recounting the lived reality of a daughter who had been forced to watch her world dissolve into ash. She told him about the assassination log she had found, the cold, clinical records of a man who traded in death and called it logistics. For the first time, the man with the scar had no retort. The power dynamic shifted in that narrow hallway. The hunter realized that the prey had spent the night learning the layout of his own trap. Amara's voice grew stronger, fueled by a righteous, incandescent fury that transcended her fear as she laid bare the architecture of his lies. She didn't stop at her father. She moved to the present, to the green route, and the girls whose lives were being auctioned off in the shadows of his security warehouses. She spoke the names of the borders he had turned into a private playground for his trafficking ring, Cotonou, Lomé, Afleo. She described the humanitarian cargo she had seen on his spreadsheets, the young women who were being moved across West Africa like cattle under the protection of his armored convoys. Elias's silence was no longer tactical. It was the stunned paralysis of a man who realized his entire kingdom was built on a fault line. Amara revealed that she hadn't just looked at the files, she had mirrored them. Every log, every coordinate, every bank record of his launder trafficking money was currently sitting in a pre-timed email queue, ready to be sent to every major news outlet and international human rights organization the moment she pressed a button or the moment her heart stopped beating. The legacy he wanted to protect was now the very thing that would ensure his execution. She told him that she would rather see her child never draw breath than have it inherit a single drop of his poisoned blood, turning his own obsession with lineage into a weapon of ultimate destruction. While Elias had been building his fortress of glass and steel, a different kind of network had been quietly forming in the shadows of the city, a collective of those he had stepped on, ignored, or exploited. Amara hadn't spent her morning merely running. She had activated the ghost protocol her father had whispered about in his final, lucid moments. Titi, the receptionist at the hotel, wasn't just a bored girl with a loose tongue. She was the sister of a man who had been disappeared by Thorn Global, part of a clandestine group of survivors who had been waiting for a crack in Elias's armor. As Elias stood outside the clinic door, his world was already beginning to dismantle itself from the outside in. In the cyber cafes of Yaba and the backrooms of Accra, the data Amara had extracted was being disseminated by a decentralized web of activists and former Thor employees. The Viper's routes were being mapped in real time, and the quiet, efficient machine of his trafficking ring was suddenly being hit by a series of anonymous, surgical strikes. The myth of Elias Thorn as the untouchable titan of security was evaporating, replaced by the terrifyingly documented reality of a transcontinental predator. Inside the clinic, Amara watched the signal on her burner phone, seeing the confirmation pings as the data reached its destinations. She had realized that the only way to beat a man who owned the law was to make his crimes too public to ignore. The underground network wasn't just about data. It was about the collective weight of the voices he had tried to silence. In Ghana and Togo, activists were already converging on the warehouse coordinates she had provided, filming the Thorn Global logos on the trucks that were meant to be invisible. The media circus outside the hospital, which Elias had intended to use as a shield, was now receiving the same leaks on their own tablets and phones. The narrative was shifting in real time, from a search for a runaway bride to an investigation into a global criminal enterprise. Elias was still standing at the door, but the ground beneath him was no longer solid. He was becoming a prisoner of his own publicity, unable to use the violence that had served him so well in the past, because the entire world was now watching every move of his leather-gloved hands. The psychological strain on Elias Thorn began to manifest in a way the public had never seen. The changed man was losing his composure. His breathing, once a steady, controlled rhythm, became ragged, a low growl that sounded like an engine failing. The scar on his face seemed to pulse with a dark, angry heat, the skin around it tightening as his carefully constructed persona disintegrated. He wasn't used to a variable he couldn't control, and Amara, the woman he had molded into his perfect queen, had become the ultimate anomaly. He began to fluctuate between desperate pleas for her to think of the child and hissed threats that revealed the raw, unrefined killer beneath the charcoal suit. He was at a breaking point, caught between the biological drive to protect his heir and the tactical necessity of silencing the only witness to his true nature. The realization that he might actually lose not just the woman, but the empire, the reputation, and the future sent a shockwave through his psyche that shattered his cold detachment. He began to kick at the door, the violence of his movements a stark contrast to the sophisticated image he had projected only minutes before. "You think you can destroy me with a few files?" he roared, his voice cracking with a terrifying, hysterical edge. "I'm a state Amara. I am the security that keeps this city from burning. Without me, there is only chaos." He was no longer the CEO. He was the assassin in the basement, the man who believed that the world owed him everything because he was willing to do the dirty work no one else would touch. He was a man who had convinced himself that his crimes were actually a form of service, a twisted logic that allowed him to sleep at night while girls were being trafficked in his name. But as the kicks grew more desperate, Amara could hear the fear behind the fury. He knew that the digital age had no respect for state secrets once they were in the hands of the mob. He was terrified of being forgotten, of becoming just another name in a long list of deposed tyrants. His morality didn't crack because he felt guilt. It cracked because he realized he was no longer the one holding the leash. The man with the scar was finally seeing his own reflection in the eyes of the world, and for the first time in his life, he didn't like what he saw. In the deafening chaos of the confrontation, Amara pressed play on a digital audio file she had found hidden in a folder marked with her birth date. It was a recording her father had made in the final weeks of his life, his voice thin and reedy, punctuated by the wet cough of a man whose lungs were failing. "Amara, my light," the voice began, drifting through the gaps in the door and filling the hallway with the sound of a dead man's wisdom. Chief Bellows spoke about the man who had taken him, not with hatred, but with a profound, terrifying pity. He had realized, even as the toxin was killing him, that his captor was a man who had no soul left to save, a man who would one day try to fill the void in his heart with the very family he had destroyed. "He will come for you," her father whispered, the sound of his breath a ghostly echo in the sterile clinic. "He will offer you the world, and he will look like a king. But remember the scar, Amara. The scar is the only honest thing about him. It is the mark of the man who can only love what he has first broken." The sound of her father's voice acted like a physical barrier between Amara and the man on the other side of the door. It was the final piece of the puzzle, a message sent across time to warn her of the predator in her bed. Elias stopped kicking. The silence that followed was more profound than any scream. For a moment, it felt as though the ghost of Chief Bello was standing in the hallway, confronting his killer. The recording continued, her father describing the exact moment Elias had injected him, detailing the coldness in the assassin's eyes, a coldness that Elias had tried to hide behind the heat of romance. "Justice isn't a bullet, Amara," the recording said. "Justice is the truth staying alive when the liar is long gone." As the recording ended, Amara felt a sense of peace settle over her, a clarity that transcended the terror of the moment. She realized that she wasn't just fighting for her own life. She was the vessel for a 20-year-old truth that was finally ready to be told. The ghost of her father had spoken, and in doing so, he had stripped the changed man of his last remaining mask. Miles away, at the border crossing between Togo and Ghana, the Green Route was experiencing a violent awakening. As Amara held the line in the clinic, the coordinates she had leaked triggered a coordinated raid by an international coalition of anti-trafficking units and local grassroots militias. The Thorn Global trucks, which had moved with impunity for years, were suddenly surrounded by a sea of flashing lights and determined faces. The drivers, men who had been paid handsomely to look the other way, found themselves staring into the lenses of a dozen smartphone cameras and the muzzles of official rifles. In the back of the vehicles, dozens of women, frightened, exhausted, but alive, were being led out into the morning sun, their liberation being live-streamed to a global audience. The cargo of souls was no longer a spreadsheet. They were human beings with voices, and those voices were starting to scream the name of the man who had enslaved them. The logistics of the Viper were being dismantled piece by piece, the supply chain of his cruelty severed at its most vital points. The news of the border raid reached the media outside the clinic in a wave of digital notifications. The reporters, who had been focused on a family tragedy, suddenly realized they were witnessing the fall of a criminal empire. The billionaire savior standing at the door was now being described on air as a suspected human trafficker and state-sponsored assassin. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. In the digital age, a reputation takes a lifetime to build and 5 minutes to incinerate. Back in the hallway, Elias's phone began to vibrate uncontrollably. Call from his lawyers, his board of directors, and the government officials who were now scrambling to distance themselves from his sinking ship. He looked at the screen, the blue light reflecting off his scar, and realized that his security was an illusion. He had built a world based on the idea that he could control every narrative, but he had forgotten that the most powerful narrative of all is the one told by the survivors. The border raid wasn't just a blow to his finances. It was the total destruction of his legacy, leaving him with nothing but the four walls of a hospital corridor and the woman who had brought him to his knees. The door to the procedure room finally opened, but not because Elias had broken it down. Amara stepped out, her posture straight, her hood down, her eyes reflecting a cold, celestial fire. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a judge. The doctor and nurses stood behind her, a silent phalanx of witnesses. Elias took a step toward her, his hand reaching out in a habitual gesture of control, but he stopped when he saw the expression on her face. There was no love left, no fear, not even hatred, only a profound, clinical detachment. She looked at the man she had almost married and saw him for exactly what he was, a collection of stolen moments and manufactured virtues. "It's over, Elias," she said, her voice carrying through the hallway and out toward the open windows where the microphones of the world were waiting. The baby is my choice, not yours. And my choice is that your bloodline ends here, not through death, but through a total refusal to let you be its father." She hadn't gone through with the procedure. She had chosen to keep the child, but to raise it in a world where the name Thorn would be synonymous with a monster that was defeated by its own hubris. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his, and he didn't stop her. He couldn't. The changed man was paralyzed by the sheer weight of his own exposure. As Amara emerged from the clinic, the wall of paparazzi erupted, but she didn't hide her face. She walked directly to the nearest camera and began to speak, her voice clear and unwavering as she detailed the crimes of Elias Thorn. She spoke for her father, for the girls at the border, and for the woman she used to be. She handed over the burner phone, the digital key to the kingdom of shadows. Elias followed her out, a broken man trailing in the wake of a goddess, his face pale and his scar looking like a jagged crack in a dead planet. The police were no longer there to protect him. They were there to escort him. The final choice wasn't about a wedding or a medical procedure. It was about the reclamation of his soul. Amara walked away from the flashing lights and the screaming crowds, heading toward a future that was uncertain and difficult. But for the first time in 20 years, it was a future that belonged entirely to her. 6 months later, the name Elias Thorn had become a cautionary tale, a footnote in the dark history of West African corporate crime. The trial had been the most watched event in the continent's history, a grueling unraveling of 20 years of state-sponsored terror and private cruelty. Elias sat in a high-security cell in Kirikiri, the charcoal suits replaced by an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow and old. The Viper was now a caged animal, stripped of his wealth, his influence, and his masks. He spent his days staring at the concrete walls, the scar on his face the only thing he had left of the man he used to be. People often asked if he was truly a changed man, now that he had lost everything. In a way, he was. He was finally the man he had always been in the dark, a small, hollow vessel of ego and greed, no longer inflated by the myth of his own power. He had changed from a king of shadows to a ghost in the light, a man whose only legacy was the universal loathing of a world he had tried to own. In a quiet house on the coast of Ghana, far from the skyscrapers and the sirens of Lagos, Amara sat on a porch overlooking the sea. Her stomach was heavy with the life inside her, a life that kicked with a vibrant, defiant energy. She had spent the last months helping the women from the border raids, using the remains of her father's recovered estate to build a sanctuary that was the opposite of everything Elias had created. She looked at the ocean and didn't see the green route. She saw a horizon that was finally clear. She knew the child would one day ask about its father, and she had already decided on the answer. She would tell the child about a man with a scar who tried to break the world, and about the woman who decided to fix it instead. She would tell the story of how the changed man was defeated not by a weapon, but by the simple, enduring power of the truth. As the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the water in shades of gold and violet, Amara finally felt the weight of the past lift. The ghost of her father was finally at peace, and for the first time in her life, so was she. He offered me $80 million to keep his secret and raise his heir in a palace built on lies and bodies. Half of you will say I should have taken the money, but I chose to burn it all down. Was I wrong to destroy a changed man over a crime buried for 20 years? Is a monster always a monster? Comment money if you take the deal, or burn if you choose justice.